And we welcome you to another edition of Dark Side of the Ring on This Is Wrestling. Lee Versage and Zach McGibbon with you. And today, Zach, we discuss the legacy, the life, and the times in the wrestling world of Leon White, better known as Big Van Vader. How are you today?
I'm doing pretty good, Lee. Very excited to talk about Vader. When this episode was announced, I was interested to hear what was going to be discussed, what was going to be covered for one of my favorite wrestlers, quite frankly. Certainly a guy that I believe is the best super heavyweight pro wrestler of all time. Loved his matches, and I will say Vader was one of those guys for me when I was kind of expanding my wrestling tastes outside of WWE. I specifically remember a match of his with Kenta Kobashi at All Japan that led me down this rabbit hole of looking up Japan and watching more of those old tapes. So Vader kind of has that connection for me when it comes to a pro wrestler. So very interested to break down his career and this recent episode of Dark Side of the Ring.
And I think when I first thought of Big Van Vader, I didn't know a lot about his football career. I had gone back and looked at some of the stuff in AWA as Leon White and Baby Bull and that. But where I first came as a guy who kind of grew up as a young teen when Vader went to Japan, just seeing some of the highlights of the man in the headdress and the horns and the smoke and you talk about a guy who looked like a monster, and in the wrestling world that's trying to dim the light between the real and the fake. That guy looked every bit of a guy who might take my head off.
Yeah.
As a monster. And I think ultimately, and we'll get to it, but the creation of what they made Vader out to be, I thought was a real, I think by the end, you realize the difference between what they made him out to be and maybe the person he really was deep down. And those were two very, very different people. But that's my first memory was what is this? The guy with the headdress and the horns, and he looks like a monster. He looks like a killer. And Japan made him look that way. I thought this was an unbelievable, as I was growing up and no internet and that kind of thing. You only kind of heard and saw some pictures, and you might have been lucky enough to see a little bit of video, and the mystique was real for this guy, for me, Zach.
Absolutely. For me, my introduction was more, in terms of Vader himself, was more kind of in recent, when I was just kind of getting out of the WWE stuff, and Vader was one of the featured characters in WWE 2K14, I believe it was. And I was like, wow, this guy is big, and he could do moonsaults, and he just had this devastating move set. And then I went deeper and deeper into Vader, and you just look up, as you mentioned, his time in Japan, and they talked about it in the Dark Side of the Ring episode where he, when he debuted, he beats Inoki, which is such a big deal in Japan because they wanted to establish him right away. And you come out and they describe him, the character and the headdress and the steam coming out. Just such a cool gimmick, and the guy behind it as well, making it legitimate and making it something like, oh, this is a guy that you do not want to mess with in the ring. Because one of the other things they also talked about with him is he was not afraid to be a little stiff in the ring when it comes to delivering his moves.
No, he wasn't. But maybe I think you're a really good guy to have on to talk about this, Zach. Is back then in, New Japan, where things were made to look, very real. That's how he was brought up. And he was brought up with, and they got into it, right? With Stan Hansen and Bruiser Brody. Like, I can't think of two guys that made it look more real all the time and work stiff than Stan Hansen and Bruiser Brody.
Yes.
Right? Like if you're going to learn to be stiff and to make it look real, those two guys to me epitomized what that meant. Like when I was growing up, Bruiser Brody was this bigger than like I was kind of scared of Bruiser Brody, right? And Stan Hansen, you saw how like he would injure people. He was stiff. His lariats were absolutely insane. So I think people need to understand, like, and maybe you can talk about it a little bit more, just the development of somebody. Okay, we're gonna make you into this killer, and he really wasn't. He was kind of a soft guy.
Yeah.
And we're gonna make you into this killer, and the people that are going to teach you are Stan Hansen and Bruiser Brody, and we're going to put you into this climate in New Japan where everything is supposed to be a little bit more real than the WWF at the time.
Absolutely. It was a lot more with New Japan because of the Inoki influence. Inoki wanted to utilize more of that mixed martial arts, what we know now, but that sort of influenced the shoot fighting stuff, and so stuff would be a little bit more legitimate with Vader in terms of his strikes, in terms of the way that he delivered moves, and like what you mentioned, what better people to learn to have, big time strikes than Bruiser Brody, and especially Stan Hansen as well. I've said this story before on the podcast, but for those that might be new tuning in, there's a famous story of Stan Hansen saying that because he's blind in one eye, and he said, I don't know where you're going sometimes, but just know that I will have my arm out and ready to go and deliver the lariat, and I'm going to go as hard as I can, and you better be there when I hit you. So that is how Stan Hansen looked at stuff when it comes to his wrestling, and you could just see it with Vader in terms of his rise. It was just the right fit for him in terms of being this killer, being Inoki, and again, that match with Inoki being, squashing Inoki too, like not just beating him, squashing him in under 3 minutes. And it's the famous story of how, it was such an impactful win that a riot was caused in Japan because Inoki lost. You want to talk about heat in terms of a professional wrestling match. That is quite a next level heat there. And that just kind of continued to grow with Vader in New Japan, obviously also splitting some time with the AWA, and but mostly being in Japan and really establishing his character there. And then they talked about, of course, the famous match at the Tokyo Dome, where, it's funny, like, people may not just understand, but just how big Stan Hansen was in Japan, but they mentioned on the show that they called him the Hulk Hogan of Japan, and it's really not that far off. He was quite a big star. I can tell you when I traveled to Japan a couple of years ago, I remember being in a library, a little bookstore, actually, and there was a little wrestling section, and there were a bunch of different wrestlers on there. And shockingly enough, I saw it was a lot more foreigners than I expected. You got your Inokis, you got Giant Baba in there, but you also had Stan Hansen and Abdullah the Butcher and the Destroyer that were in there. That just kind of goes to show just how big of a name he was in Japan and how well known he was. And so to have him in this match with Vader at the Tokyo Dome is a big deal. And then obviously this is the match where Hansen, because they're just throwing blows, they're both stiff and they're throwing blows. It's a fun match to watch. But there is the shall I say, gruesome moment, I guess, where Hansen knocks Vader's eyeball out of his head legitimately because he hits him so hard. And Vader literally, like, his eye is swollen up, and he just pushes his eyeball back into his socket and just finishes the match. It's a different time, Lee, in terms of how injuries kind of go about and how wrestlers go about, but it's still quite the visual, and I hadn't seen that spot in a while, and seeing it again was just like, man, I especially with the 2025 lens, it's just like, man, that is a gnarly spot.
Well, and to legitimately push your eyeball back in and keep going is utterly insane. And I think to try and let people understand, like, Antonio Inoki was, like, how would you describe Inoki in Japan at that time? Like, if you think Stan Hansen was Hulk Hogan, Oh my god!
Oh, he
Like,
was much bigger than Hogan. Much bigger than Hogan.
so think about that. Just, I hope people can let that try to sink in. That Antonio Inoki in Japan was, I don't even know how to say how much bigger he was than Hulk Hogan in the United States. Imagine that.
It's crazy to think about. Very, very crazy. And he's and the crazy part about that too, because pro wrestling is kind of in the culture of Japan too, that he might not even be the biggest star to come out of Japan. Like, I would argue Ricky Dozan's probably the biggest in terms of the culture shift that he was able to bring by bringing pro wrestling, but Inoki was not that far behind. Like, he went into government as well, and Inoki obviously was the longtime face of New Japan. So he was such a big deal in Japan. Such a big deal.
And so to squash that guy and create a riot afterwards, and then to become IWGP, he was the first, correct?
Yes.
Non-Japanese wrestler?
Yes. There's a different version of the belt that I think Hogan won, because Hogan also worked Japan, but it's not the same belt that they mentioned here. It was a different belt. But yes, he was the first American to win it.
So he squashes a guy that was, much bigger than Hogan in Japan than Hogan was in the States. He squashed that guy. He was the first non-Japanese wrestler to hold the IWGP Heavyweight Championship, and he held it 3 times.
Yeah.
And got his eyeball knocked out and kept going.
Yeah.
So when he came back to the United States into WCW, Zach, just from a humanity point of view, I'm putting myself in a spot of somebody who understood that he was big, athletic, could do a lot of things. I don't think had that. Well, without knowing him, he didn't, because unfortunately, some of the best wrestlers ever, when we go over, and we've said this over and over, when we talk about the top 10 all-time wrestlers, they are very, very, very selfish.
Yeah.
For the most part. And they do, and this episode showed you that people on top of the United States were going to do anything they could do to stay on top, and if you weren't that type, you could be pushed down by them. And we'll talk about that in a bit, but I just think I can't remember, Zach, an example of somebody who I don't think was like that true mean killer instinct and have it in them, and then to be placed in a position where you weren't just a monster. You were the guy who squashed Antonio Inoki and pushed his eyeball back in, and was the first non-Japanese wrestler to ever hold that title, and you held it 3 times. Like, you weren't just a monster, you were the monster of the wrestling world. And so when you came back, and it's not sort of ingrained in you to be that. Like, when I watch Ric Flair, like him or don't like him or whatever he was, living his gimmick in the 80s and the 90s, maybe his whole life, it's ingrained in him to be that way.
Yep.
I don't think you can doubt that. And again, probably to his downfall, but it was ingrained in him to be that way. This was not ingrained in Leon White to be this way. And so when people are telling you that you're this, not just a monster, but the monster, and you have to work a certain way, and you have to really, every single time you have to come across as the biggest King Kong Godzilla monster ever in the history of the world, I can at least empathize with the story of that's not who you are inside, and this is what people are asking you to do every day of your life. That could not have been easy.
No, definitely not, especially with the schedule compared to I know that the Japanese style, especially in New Japan and All Japan at that time, could be a lot more of a toll on the body, but the schedule was not as frequent as it would be in the States at that time when you include house shows and obviously TV, pay-per-view. And so having to be on the road all the time if you're Vader, and having to be that guy, and that was kind of something they talked about too on the show, where as it kind of went along, they talked with his ex-wife and mentioned how as he kind of continued his wrestling career, she started to see less of Leon White and more of this character of Vader that was kind of being put in to the scene. But you want to talk about a guy that made like an impact right away coming into WCW, obviously becoming the world heavyweight champion, and being paired with Harley Race as well to try and get familiar right away for this WCW crowd, and beating guys like Sting and facing off against Ric Flair, and really establishing himself as sort of the monster guy that you can rely on in WCW. I also think to the Cactus Jack matches as well, which they talked about, and how stiff they were. And, we talked about Mick Foley in episode 1 of this series and just some of the bumps he's taken in his career. Imagine having to be on the other end of a match with Vader, who's known to, throw some bombs if need be. So it was interesting in that element in terms of a character analysis that Dark Side of the Ring put in about this guy that, like you mentioned, there's the soft side of him, and then there was Vader, the character, the gimmick that he portrayed, and how as time kind of continued to go on, how those two kind of meshed together.
And so he comes over, as you said, he's with Harley Race. He becomes the WCW champion and having, a ton of success. He ends up losing to Ric Flair, which is a pretty memorable match.
Mm-hmm.
And then what happened, Zach? Tell me what happened after Vader was an absolute monster and was kind of even though he lost to Flair, he was still a monster in that world. I think there was 2 things that happened, and one was something in the ring where they talked about, unfortunately, injuring. And I apologize for his. I should have his name here. But it was a jobber match, and he ended up temporarily paralyzing him.
Yep, the story of Joe Thurmond is what you're looking for.
Joe Thurmond. Yeah. And again, I think you could really empathize with the fact that if that's not in your nature, when you hurt somebody, you probably are going to feel bad regardless. But if you're a bit of a softie inside and you actually hurt somebody to the point that you don't know whether they're going to live the same way after that, I actually can't imagine what that, and look, that's happened in the wrestling world before, and I don't know how people move on from that.
Yeah, it's tough. I can only imagine, sort of the mental side of things. And I know that when they talked about, they actually had Joey Thurman on to talk about that match and what he was feeling, what he heard from Vader. And clearly it sounded like to me a guy that was so into his character at that point in Vader that he kind of lost sight of, at the end of the day, you still want to protect guys. Bret Hart has always talked about and put over himself because it's Bret Hart, but the fact that he, never went out and injured guys. He always wanted to make it look real, but he never went out and injured guys. And so this was a case of Joey Thurman. They talked about in the match where took some nasty bumps, including that choke slam that they showed in the video. And Thurman wasn't able to, work the same way ever again. They mentioned that he broke his back in 2 places, almost severed his spinal cord, which is just some brutal injuries. And, Leon White eventually, goes see him in the hospital and is just overcome with emotion with what happened. And again, it goes back to that sort of character analysis that they did with him of like the character and the person, Leon White.
And then the other thing was, okay, if you're a monster, you need to go up against the top face of the company, who at that point was Hulk Hogan.
Yep.
And I don't think Hulk Hogan wanted anything to do with Mr. Vader.
No, Hogan doesn't seem like the guy that wants to take some of the bumps that Vader was looking for his character, for sure.
Yeah, but quite honestly, like if you're going to go up against a monster to overcome the odds, like you went up against Andre the Giant, you never took a bump in your life
Yeah.
from that guy.
Yeah.
Right? So if you're going to go up against a monster in 95 and like you're going to have to take something. And he didn't want to take anything. And so, look, Vader got a bit of a tough to work with rap and a stiff rap. But I mean, this was Hulk Hogan at his finest at the top going, yeah, I'm not working with that guy.
Brother.
And when the top of the company says, I'm not working with that guy, and you're supposed to be this monster, what are you going to do with him? The guy was, we just went over his career to that point where he was WCW champion. He was IWGP champion. He was the monster of monsters. And if Hogan wasn't going to do anything with him, what could you have done? Like it's almost, I don't see a spot for that. And then they let him go like he's bad for business or something. And man, I think that's tough on somebody's psyche when that probably doesn't have as much to do with you as you think it does. Would you agree with that?
Oh, totally agree. Having to kind of deal with that, and that was kind of also foretold in what would happen with Vader going to the WWF as well. Having to deal with that sort of backstage political mess with a guy like Hogan, and having to realize that you can't be the guy that you've been booked as for so long, and having to change stuff because of it, certainly would have a mental impact. And again, kind of foreshadowing what was go on the WWF. And then really the final straw for WCW at the end, they mentioned the fight between he and Paul Orndorff. And that's a legendary fight now, unfortunately, where Orndorff and Vader got into it. Orndorff was calling Vader to do some promos, and Vader didn't go in, and Orndorff said some not nice things about Vader, as I keep it PG, and it eventually led to a scrap between the two, and that was kind of reason enough for WCW to say, "Hey, we're going to move on from you and move forward past you," because at that point, Vader had been in the company for a couple of years, and it was not the same, big heavyweight guy that came into WCW. Still did a lot of very good work in that company, but decided to move on from him.
So they move on, and eventually he goes with Camp Cornette to the WWF at the time. Just kind of talk about that run, and then you mentioned Shawn Michaels, and look, you were in Japan. You talked about I've been at some memorable events in my life. Well, I was at SummerSlam 1996 at the Gund Arena in Cleveland, Ohio, with the main event of Shawn Michaels and Vader. And a botched spot that, whether he was supposed to move from an elbow drop or they got their communication tangled, Shawn Michaels was not happy and showed his unhappiness in the middle of a match like a preschooler. Yeah. And I remember it vividly going, I was in the upper deck, and I remember looking at it going, just, when like but you don't know. And there's a lot of that back then with no internet, there was the internet. I just started, but you weren't on the internet. It was DOS, right. And like 15 minutes to look up one page. And
right.
So you just knew when you were watching it that something happened there where that wasn't right. And Michael threw a bit of a temper tantrum, and you didn't quite know why or like exactly what happened, but you just knew, yeah, that's not part of what was supposed to go on in the match. And again, Vader's problem, right? A little bit too stiff, hurts a couple guys, and you get people at the top that want to keep their spot and want to make sure that other people are kept down. When you can't go in and Hogan doesn't want to work with you, whether you're right or wrong, it's not a good spot for you. And then you go into the WWF and you got Vince and Shawn, and they're not thrilled with what you're doing, and they could be totally in the wrong, which I think they were in this case. But if you're not going to make that guy a monster, what are you going to do with him? And you could see it just erode his mental state, Zach.
Absolutely. And then they touched on that too in terms of like just some of the angles that came for him afterwards in the WWF. But yeah, the big thing as well, like Vader wasn't exactly endearing himself to the locker room, as you mentioned, with this style. You know, they also touched upon, you know, he was not exactly the most nicest spelling man either. That was also kind of a lore that they put in there.
Hygienic, he was not.
Yeah, he was not the greatest on that. I'm surprised they didn't talk about the story about how sometimes with his ring gear, like he wouldn't wash his ring gear, and then also he would also put it on backwards and not realize that it would be on backwards. So if you notice, sometimes in Vader's matches, you'd have the It's Vader time at the front, but sometimes it'll also be at the back. So nonetheless, they talked about that. So there are certainly things that, you know, Vader didn't really ingratiate himself very well, and they touched on it there. But I still firmly believe that the WWF firmly dropped the ball in terms of what they had with him, and with especially with Vince McMahon not understanding what he had in Vader, because Vince McMahon lives in his own world. He lives in the WWF world. He's not looking at all these other promotions intently and analyzing all these wrestlers. And so he sees Vader, and he wants to call him the Mastodon, as Jim Cornette mentions. Like, what are you doing? This is a guy that dominated Japan. He dominated WCW when he arrived. We've got this big heavyweight, and Jim Ross even mentioned it. Like, man, we've got this steel here. We've got probably one of the best super heavyweights and this next killer heel on our team, and that's going to help us, the company that was not doing so well at that time in 95, 96. And they just absolutely dropped the ball in terms of how they want to go about it. And obviously the stuff with Shawn didn't help when it came to that spot, and Shawn throwing a hissy fit, and Cornette and another classic Cornette rant, kind of going after Shawn Michaels for being unprofessional, to say the least. And so, yeah, afterwards, you just see the mental psyche. They just don't understand this guy, and because of it, he starts to gain weight. They talk about the story of him going with Yokozuna to this weight loss clinic, and he's actually gaining weight there because they're sneaking in food to the facility, and they start booking him into more of these outlandish angles. And obviously, you know, in 98, early 1998, he cuts that promo, talk about how he was a fat piece of bleep, as mentioned in the promo. And
his exact wording of that was, I made the biggest mistake of my life. Maybe Vader time is over. I'm nothing but a big piece of bleep, a big fat piece of bleep.
Yeah. And then knocks the microphone away and walks off.
But when you say that on television, unless there is a full story behind you that you're going to get to the bottom and you're going to find your way back up after refinding your self-confidence, you're dead in the water.
Yeah.
You can't say that. And when I say that, like, first of all, that's on him. He can't say that. But it's also on the company to go, look what we've turned this guy into.
Yeah.
Look what we've done to this guy. That guy is saying that stuff on a pay-per-view on national television. Come on.
Yeah.
Like, that's terrible, because if you saw that, immediately you'd think, okay, well, he's going to be the down on his luck guy. He'll find rock bottom, and then they'll bring him back. They'll find a way back for him to be the monster. That's what I would think when I was watching that. No, that wasn't the case. That was just how he felt.
Yep. And also, too, should mention as well, they mentioned the incident in Kuwait where he attacks the talk show host because the talk show host is asking if wrestling is fake. And they do the whole wrestler deal where keeping kayfabe and saying, is this fake, brother? And there's been a whole bunch of stories about, like, you know, Vader thought that the talk show host was in on it, and they thought it was an angle, and it went off the rails, blah, blah, blah. At the end of the day, that also didn't ingratiate himself very well with the WWF by getting involved in a literal international incident going on in Kuwait with that. So all those things kind of combined together in that promo at Over the Edge. And really, they talked about it there. It's like a lot of the stuff that kind of goes on TV is what Vince thinks of you. And unfortunately, that's what Vince felt about Vader. And which is just, mind-blowing, considering what he had accomplished in the past. And this is how Vince McMahon thought of Big Van Vader going into the WWF.
And obviously, it just never after that, Zach. Yeah, he wrestled for a while, but it all went downhill after that. And he and his wife divorced. He drank a lot. He had congestive heart failure. Man, like you just see the diminishing of the person, and it is one of those kind of cautionary tales. And it makes me appreciate, as I watch this, it makes me appreciate the people that were always able to keep the understanding. And I know it sounds simple, right? This is the part that sounds simple to a lot of people. Zach McGibbon or Hornswoggle, the pro wrestler, isn't the same as Zach McGibbon, the person. Okay, well, I think most people would say, yeah, of course they're not. But when people start to live their gimmick and they start to believe some of the things that are just every day ingrained into, like, they're pushed to be, you got to live your character. You got to be your character. Kayfabe, you got to do it all the time. You got to be stiff. You got to look like a monster. But then you got to turn it off. And if you don't turn it off successfully, you're looked as a kind of a bad person.
Yeah.
And this is what happens to love you. It's a really hard life. And this is what I took from the end of this, is that, look, you choose to get into professional wrestling, and even if you don't understand it at first, you do start to understand it as it goes along. You choose this life. But it's a life that you better understand that you should be able to turn it off, because if you can't, probably bad things are going to happen at the end. And I appreciate more the, and I don't know them personally, but I think of guys like Bryan Danielson. I think of guys like Samoa Joe, guys that are able to completely understand the line and where their personal lives start and where their, what wrestling is and all that stuff. And they don't live their gimmick 24/7.
Yeah.
Because if you do, there's a chance that you could end up like this. And it's really sad, because he was probably, as they said on the broadcast, and I don't disagree, he was the best super heavyweight for at least a decade, at least, maybe more, ever in wrestling. And a big softy that could have been, you just think about what could have been with his career. He could have been one of the greatest acts of all time. And it didn't end up that way for him.
Which is unfortunate, because just how much he was able to accomplish and what could have a little bit more could have been accomplished. I still view him as the greatest super heavyweight of all time, and all the matches that he had. And I know I understood narratively why they did it for Dark Side of the Ring, because he did have a bit of a rebound in Japan afterwards, going to All Japan for a few years. Mm-hmm. And he was able to kind of revitalize his character a little bit. He ended up being a top drawing guy for All Japan before they ultimately split off and guys went to Pro Wrestling Noah. But afterwards, definitely, the bookings don't come as much, and he's somebody that eventually, like, he would pop up for a Legends night or something like that, but otherwise kind of went out of the wrestling business a little bit more, and would work your typical indies. And with everything that he was able to accomplish when it comes to Japan and stuff in WCW before Hogan kind of came in, and he certainly accomplished a lot. It just it's unfortunate, because you see some of the other aspects, and it's stuff in wrestling that we see all the time when it comes to the political nature of it backstage, and guys keeping their spots, that you just wish that Vader could have been even more and been one of those recognizable names that people kind of associate with. But nonetheless, I I did enjoy this Dark Side of the Ring episode. I thought they covered everything they could when it comes to Vader, and where he was at in his career, and some of the things that he was able to accomplish, some of the things that were against him. And I thought this was a really well done episode. I really like this edition of Dark Side.
Yeah, I think it really gave an indication, although the ending isn't the best. It is called Dark Side of the Ring, and this was a real tale of how a career can go and some of the things that you might not have known about one of the greats, one of the absolute greats in Big Van Vader. All right, coming up next Zach episode is Tony Atlas, Too Much Too Soon. Another one I'm quite looking forward to. He's very talkative.
Yes,
Tony Atlas. He likes to talk. So I am interested in seeing the next one and looking forward to breaking it down with you. Tony Atlas, Too Much Too Soon.
Yeah, it should be an interesting look at him in terms of his the thing I associate with Tony Atlas the most is his tag team with Rocky Johnson in the WWF. And so I'm interested to see where it kind of goes from there with Tony Atlas.
So that is Dark Side of the Ring, Big Van Vader. For Zach McGibbon, I'm Lee Versage. Thanks for listening to another edition of This is Wrestling.